Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. This is a journey into a quieter corner of the past, where stories are not told in the language of shouting battles or rushing victories, but in the softer tones of slow beginnings, uneasy glances, and the small choices that set the stage for centuries. Before we drift into it, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so these quiet stories can keep travelling further, perhaps even reaching someone else who needs a gentle way to fall asleep tonight. And in the comments, share your location and the exact time you're listening. It's always calming to picture those tiny lights spread across the world, each one of you pausing together, though separated by oceans and hours. Now let us step onto the shores where two powers first noticed one another. The Mediterranean Sea has always been more than water. It is a stage where countless empires rehearsed their power, where sailors traced invisible lines between continents, and where entire civilizations learned how to see themselves in the reflections of foreign shores. Before Rome and Carthage ever struck each other with iron, they first measured one another across these restless waters. Their rivalry was not born in a single moment of hostility, but rather in the slow recognition that two growing powers could not stretch in the same direction without touching. In the early centuries of their existence, neither Rome nor Carthage appeared destined to dominate the known world. They began humbly, as all great rivals do. Carthage rose on the northern edge of Africa, where the sea curved like an open hand, catching the winds of trade from east and west. Rome grew inland, along a river whose muddy banks carried the scent of farm fields and timber, not salt water or commerce. One looked outward, toward the horizon of ships and distant coasts. The other looked inward, at hills, valleys and villages that seemed unremarkable except for the stubbornness of the people who lived there. When we imagine their first glance, it was not through ambassadors or armies, but through merchants. For centuries before swords were drawn, goods travelled between them. From Carthage came dyes as dark as midnight, glass that caught the sunlight, and silver drawn from the mines of Iberia. From Rome came grain, wine, and hardy goods shaped from the land. These exchanges were cautious, never intimate. Each power suspected the other, even as they counted the profit. The sea carried not only wealth, but also whispers, rumours of ambition, of a people who could not be satisfied with what they already held. Carthage, in its essence, was a city of the sea. Founded, so the story said, by wanderers from Tyre, it carried with it the legacy of the Phoenicians, masters of ships and trade. Its harbour was a marvel of design, a ringed sanctuary of docks where hundreds of vessels could be hidden like pearls in a shell. From there, Carthaginian captains sailed far, planting colonies along coasts, weaving a net of influence that stretched from Africa to Spain, from the Balearic Islands to Sardinia and Corsica. To the Carthaginians, control of the sea was not simply strategy, it was identity. Their power was measured in sails, in the creak of oars, in the ability to choke the passage of goods. Rome, by contrast, had no harbour worth the name. The Tiber was a muddy artery, and Roman eyes were slow to turn seaward. They were farmers, soldiers, lawmakers, and builders of roads. Their ships were small, their naval experience limited. Yet Rome had something that Carthage lacked, a relentless hunger for territory that lay just beyond the reach of their spears. Rome's growth was not swift, but steady, spreading across the Italian peninsula like roots beneath the soil. Town by town, people were absorbed into a system that gave them both duties and privileges. Where Carthage extended influence through trade and treaties, Rome bound its conquests with roads, colonies, and citizenship. The first true contact between Rome and Carthage did not come as war, but as agreement. In treaties written long before their wars, they marked boundaries of trade and influence, acknowledging each other with wary respect. Carthage would not sail near certain Italian coasts. Rome would not trade in parts of Africa. For a time, these lines held, but lines on parchment are fragile when tested by ambition. The island of Sicily stood between them like a stone cast into the centre of the Mediterranean. Fertile, wealthy, and perfectly placed, it was a jewel no power could ignore. Carthage had colonies there, trading posts where sailors found shelter and merchants gathered grain. Rome, having secured its hold on Italy, now looked across the narrow waters and saw Sicily not as a neighbour's possession, but as an extension of their own horizon. The rivalry that would shape centuries began with this island, glimmering like a prize within reach of both. But before Sicily became the battleground, the air between Rome and Carthage was filled with the silent calculations of rulers and generals. Each side measured the other's strength. Carthage wondered at Rome's growing legions, disciplined in ways that mercenaries could never match. Rome wondered at Carthage's fleets, vast and experienced, able to choke the sea lanes that Italy depended upon for survival. It was as if two predators had noticed one another across a plain, circling, aware that one day only one might remain. The shores of Italy and Africa faced one another, not with warmth, but with inevitability. To the Romans, Carthage was both opportunity and threat. Its wealth was tempting, its influence a barrier. To the Carthaginians, Rome was an upstart, a land power whose reach had grown faster than expected. Their glances became stares, their stares became suspicion, and suspicion prepared the ground for hostility. And yet, in those early years, there was no war cry, no clash of swords. There was only the quiet understanding that two worlds had collided in ambition. Carthage carried the memory of Phoenician voyages, the scent of incense and cedar from the east, the discipline of merchant princes. Rome carried the weight of farmers turned soldiers, the resolve of men who fought for land they tilled with their own hands. Two different spirits, bound to the same sea, destined to clash not because they hated each other, but because neither could remain still. We must imagine the merchants who first carried the news home. A Roman sailor returning from the southern coasts, speaking of the vast harbours of Carthage, where ships seemed endless. A Carthaginian captain reporting to his council that the Romans, once confined to their hills, now fielded armies that swallowed whole regions. These stories became the lenses through which each power watched the other. With every tale, the rivalry deepened, not yet in blood, but in the mind. The Mediterranean itself seemed to sense the tension. The waves carried more than trade. They carried echoes of futures yet to unfold. Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, all islands that sat like pawns on a board, their fates dependent on who seized them first. Every harbour, every stretch of coastline, was a step in a game neither side could avoid playing. Thus, the shores where Rome and Carthage first glanced at each other were not only geographical, they were symbolic. They marked the threshold of an age in which two great powers would test not only their armies and fleets, but their very ways of being. Carthage, with its reliance on wealth, trade, and mercenary strength. Rome, with its discipline, citizenship, and the stubbornness of people who refused to yield. It began quietly. It began with ships passing one another at sea, with envoys exchanging words, with treaties inked on scrolls. But beneath that quiet surface, the currents were already pulling both powers toward the same conclusion: that the Mediterranean was not vast enough for them both. The first glance, then, was not innocent. It was heavy with possibility, with the weight of coming wars. And yet, in that moment, neither Rome nor Carthage could have imagined how far their rivalry would carry them, not only through Sicily, or across the sea to Iberia and Africa, but into the very memory of history itself. For it was this glance across the shores that began the story of how Rome, tested by its greatest rival, would rise to wealth, to empire, and to a kind of dominion that even Carthage, master of the sea, could never escape. The Mediterranean has always been a cradle of beginnings, where stories of gods and mortals mingle with the sound of waves against stone. Among its many cities, few were born with such intimacy to the sea as Carthage. To speak of Carthage is to speak of salt and wind, of harbours shaped like crescents, of sails rising like forests along the horizon. It was not simply a settlement placed upon the land, it was a city whose very breath came from the water, whose wealth and identity were drawn endlessly from the tide. Long before Rome turned its gaze outward, the ancestors of Carthage had already learned to master the sea. They came, according to the legends, from Tyre, a city of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians were not conquerors of territory, but conquerors of distance. Their oars and sails stitched together distant shores, trading cedar glass and purple dye for silver grain and tin. To them, the sea was not a boundary, but a road, a living highway connecting worlds. When Tyrian settlers landed on the coast of North Africa, they carried with them not only their gods and their language, but the habits of merchants who believed survival depended upon the sea. Carthage grew where the coastline bent like a natural embrace, offering safety from storms and the gift of harbours that could be shaped into wonders. Its people, pragmatic and restless, transformed this inlet into a pair of sanctuaries. One served the merchants, where ships loaded with goods from Spain, Sardinia, and the eastern shores unloaded their wares. The other belonged to the navy, a hidden circle of docks that could shelter hundreds of warships. From above, it looked as though Carthage had carved an eye into the land, always watching the waters around it. The city's strength did not lie in walls or armies alone, but in this perfect marriage of stone and sea. Wealth flowed into Carthage like a tide that never receded. Silver from Iberian mines glittered in its markets. Grain from fertile valleys fed its citizens and its soldiers. Ivory, gold, and exotic animals came from deeper Africa, carried northward by caravans, and placed into the hands of Carthaginian traders. Every day, the city hummed with the rhythm of exchange. Bargaining voices mingled with the creak of wagons, the clatter of amphorae, the cries of sailors returning from distant journeys. For Carthage, to live was to trade, and to trade was to live. Yet wealth alone cannot explain the power that Carthage became. The sea gave it more than riches, it gave it reach. Carthaginian sailors pushed their way westward, planting colonies on islands that dotted the Mediterranean like stepping stones. Ibiza, Sardinia, Corsica, each one became both a trading post and a fortress. In this way, Carthage wove a net across the waters, a web of influence that could ensnare any rival who dared to rise. To control the sea was to control the movement of others, and Carthage, more than any city of its age, understood this truth. But the Carthaginians were not merely traders, they were also pragmatists in war. Unlike Rome, where every citizen might be called to serve in the legions, Carthage did not rely solely on its own sons for battle. Its citizens, focused on commerce and governance, often hired others to fight on their behalf. Iberian swordsmen, Libyan spearmen, Numidian cavalry, all were drawn into Carthage's service. To some, this reliance on mercenaries was a weakness. To Carthage, it was a necessity, an efficient way to harness the diverse strengths of peoples scattered across its sphere of influence. Where Roman strength came from discipline and uniformity, Carthaginian power came from variety and adaptability. Still, beneath the hum of commerce and the strength of fleets, Carthage was not without shadows. Great wealth draws envy, and great reach invites conflict, its colonies sometimes strained against the grip of the mother city. Its mercenaries, once the coin stopped flowing, could turn restless, even dangerous. And while Carthage dominated the sea, it often struggled to command the same unity on land. The city was powerful, but its strength was always tied to motion, ships sailing, trade flowing, silver glinting. To halt was to weaken, and to weaken was to invite rivals. Religion, too, gave Carthage its unique character. The gods of the Phoenicians lived on in its temples, but with faces shaped by African soil and Carthaginian fear. Baal Hammon, lord of the sky and fertility, and Tanit, the great goddess, watched over the city with stern eyes. The rituals performed in their honour were whispered about by outsiders with a mixture of awe and dread. Some spoke of sacrifices made to secure favour, of fires burning in the night, of cries carried upward with the smoke. Whether truth or slander, these stories cast Carthage as a city both powerful and mysterious. A place where wealth was matched by an intensity of devotion. In the daily life of its people, Carthage thrived as a crossroads. Streets wound through markets, crowded with goods from every corner of the Mediterranean. The air carried scents both familiar and foreign, spices from Arabia, oils from Iberia, incense from the Levant. Languages mingled, coins changed hands, and the city pulsed like a heart pumping wealth outward. The Carthaginian elite lived in grand houses overlooking the sea, while artisans and sailors filled the neighbourhoods closer to the docks. Life was neither equal nor simple, but it was vibrant, driven by the same restless energy that had carried their ancestors from the east. To Rome, watching from across the waters, Carthage was both admired and feared. Here was a city that seemed to have mastered the art of prosperity, a city where ships crowded harbours the way sheep filled pastures in Italy. Its fleets were unmatched, its wealth daunting. But wealth and sea power alone could not shield Carthage from destiny. For every harbour it built, Rome built a road. For every treaty Carthage signed, Rome absorbed another ally into its growing system. The two powers were different in their essence, yet each was expanding outward, and the Mediterranean was not infinite. The rise of Carthage was not only a tale of ships and markets, it was also a tale of identity, of a people who believed the sea had chosen them. Generations of Carthaginians were raised to believe that beyond the horizon lay opportunity, and that opportunity must be seized. To sit still was to invite decline. The Mediterranean was their inheritance, and every wave seemed to whisper promises of wealth and danger. Yet beneath the splendour of Carthage lay a fragility invisible to those who saw only its harbours and markets. Its reliance on mercenaries meant its armies did not always fight for love of the city, but for the weight of its silver. Its colonies could feel more like possessions than partners. Its people, secure in their wealth, sometimes lacked the martial discipline that hardened Rome. It was a city of brilliance, but brilliance can cast deep shadows. As the sun set over its harbours, with ships returning home and the cries of gulls circling above, Carthage seemed unassailable. From its walls one could look outward and see influence stretching across the sea like a cloak. And yet, far across the waters, in a land of farmers and soldiers, Rome was stirring. The glance that had passed between them was becoming heavier, charged with the knowledge that two ways of life, two visions of power, were destined to meet. Carthage, the city born from the sea, had claimed the waves as its own. But the sea is never a possession. It is only a pathway, a space between rivals. And across that pathway, Rome was waiting. Across the Mediterranean, where the river Tiber wound its slow way to the sea, Another city was stirring, unlike Carthage, whose birth was cradled by waves and ships. This place began as nothing more than a cluster of huts on a hill, a settlement that seemed too modest to ever cast its shadow across the world. Rome did not rise from abundance. It rose from hunger, from necessity, and from the hard soil of central Italy, where survival demanded both strength and stubbornness. The land that surrounded this small village was neither particularly rich nor especially barren. The plains of Latium offered grain and pasture, enough to sustain families, but never enough to satisfy ambition. Hills ringed the region, dotted with groves and rocky outcrops, while marshes spread along the lower valleys, breeding fever and hardship. To live here was to struggle, and that struggle gave shape to a people who valued discipline above comfort to us, who measured worth not by wealth, but by resilience. The Tiber itself was not a grand river. Its waters ran muddy and restless, prone to floods, difficult for large ships, but it was a lifeline nonetheless. Through it, Rome connected to the wider world, though at first only in the most modest way. Traders could bring salt from the coast, wood from the forests, and stone from the hills. The village that grew upon its banks was not impressive, but it was persistent. And persistence has a power greater than beauty. Stories of Rome's earliest days were wrapped in legend. The tale of Romulus and Remus, twins raised by a she-wolf, spoke less to history than to spirit. It told of survival against impossible odds, of the belief that Rome was born to endure. These myths were not idle fables. They were the foundation of identity. To be Roman was to believe one belonged to a people chosen by fate, not because of wealth or divine favour, but because of unyielding strength. As generations passed, the village expanded, taking on the character of a community that understood both cooperation and competition. Its people were farmers first, soldiers second, but the line between the two was thin. Every man was expected to defend what little he owned, to fight for the soil that fed his family. War, for Rome, was not distant or optional. It was woven into daily life, born of constant disputes with neighbours, with rival villages, with tribes that wandered across the peninsula. Out of this endless conflict came the legions, disciplined, adaptable, and relentless. Where Carthage measured its strength in ships, Rome measured its strength in men who were willing to fight, march, and endure. The Roman soldier was not a mercenary, but a citizen. His loyalty was not bought with silver, but bound by duty, by the promise that victory brought honour not just to himself, but to the entire community. This bond, simple and unbreakable, made Rome more than a village. It made it a force that could spread outward, claiming not just land, but allegiance. Rome's expansion across Italy was not swift, nor was it marked by single great victories. It was a slow tightening of grip, like vines climbing and binding themselves to stone. Some towns were conquered outright, their walls torn down, and their people subdued. Others were drawn in by treaties. Their leaders offered a share in Rome's growing system of citizenship. The brilliance of Rome's rise lay not only in battle, but in governance. Defeated enemies were rarely destroyed completely. Instead they were absorbed, their young men placed in Roman legions, their resources feeding Roman campaigns. In this way, every war Rome fought only made it stronger, swelling its ranks with new allies, who gradually became Romans themselves. Life within Rome reflected this spirit of practicality and endurance. Its streets were not adorned with the luxury of Carthaginian markets. Its houses were modest, its temples plain, its festivals marked more by solemn ritual than extravagance. The Senate, that gathering of elders, spoke not with eloquence meant to dazzle, but with caution, weighing decisions as carefully as farmers weigh seed before planting. To outsiders, Rome might have seemed austere, even harsh, But beneath that austerity was an unshakable unity. Religion, too, was part of this practical rhythm. Roman gods were guardians of fields, of thresholds, of hearths and boundaries. Every act of life, from sowing crops to declaring war, was marked by ritual. In honouring the gods, Romans affirmed the structure of their world, a structure built on duty, order, and continuity. Where Carthage's gods demanded devotion through fire and mystery, Rome's gods demanded constancy, a daily acknowledgement that discipline was sacred. What made Rome unique was not brilliance, but relentlessness. When armies faltered, they were rebuilt. When defeats came, they were endured and learned from. No single disaster could break the city because its strength did not rest on wealth or chance, but on a collective will to persist. This resilience would one day be tested against Carthage in ways almost unimaginable, but even in its earliest days, the seed of that endurance was visible. The people of Rome were also gifted with geography that was less forgiving than Carthage's harbours, but more protective in its own way. The hills on which the city rose gave natural defence. The central position on the Italian peninsula allowed influence to radiate outward in all directions. Though lacking a great navy, Rome could spread steadily across land, subduing its neighbours until the peninsula itself seemed destined to fall under its sway. And once the peninsula was secure, the horizon could not remain ignored. The Roman dream of conquest did not begin with grand designs of empire. It began with survival, defeating rival villages, securing farmland, ensuring that enemies could not rise again to threaten them. Yet with each victory, the dream grew larger, each road built, each town subdued, each treaty signed created a sense of momentum. Rome was no longer merely defending itself. It was reshaping Italy, binding it into a network of alliances and obligations that revolved around the city on the Tiber. As generations passed, what had once been a village became something more enduring. The Forum, once a gathering place for farmers and traders, became the heart of governance. Stone walls replaced wooden palisades. Temples grew more elaborate, arches more imposing, roads more ambitious. Still, the memory of struggle remained in the character of the people. Rome never forgot its humble beginnings, and this memory gave its citizens a sense of purpose. To prove that a city born of mud and sweat could outlast those born of wealth and sea. Rome, unlike Carthage, did not rely on mercenaries. Its soldiers were its citizens, its generals often drawn from the Senate, its victories shared as communal triumphs. This unity made Rome resilient in ways that wealth alone could not replicate. Where Carthaginian power might waver if trade faltered or mercenaries rebelled, Roman power only grew with each battle. Defeat was a lesson, not a breaking point. Losses hardened them, made them more determined. Victory was not merely celebrated, it was expected, as natural as the harvest. The village that dreamed of conquest did so not because it sought luxury, but because it believed its destiny was survival through dominance. Every step outward was both protection and ambition. To control Italy was to secure food, soldiers, and strength. To control the Mediterranean would one day seem inevitable. For now, Rome's gaze stretched across its hills, down its valleys, and into the waters that led toward Sicily, where the presence of Carthage loomed like a shadow on the horizon. From the smoke of hearths rising above simple rooftops, from the dusty marches of farmers turned soldiers, from the discipline of a Senate that preferred caution to extravagance, Rome was building itself into something far greater than a village. It was shaping a character that would endure wars, disasters, and rivalries. A character that would, in time, face Carthage not as a humble neighbour, but as an equal, and eventually, as a conqueror. Rome's dream of conquest was not yet fulfilled, but it had already begun. And dreams once stirred rarely rest quietly. Between Italy and Africa, where the sea narrows and the winds carry voices from both continents, lies a land that has always drawn the attention of empires. Sicily, with its fertile soil and strategic harbours, seemed less an island than a bridge, an unavoidable crossroad where the ambitions of great powers would one day collide. It was here, on this triangular piece of earth, that the long rivalry between Rome and Carthage would ignite into open conflict. The island had never belonged solely to one people. Its history was a mosaic of arrivals and departures, of settlers and conquerors who left their marks upon its fields and cities. Greeks had come, planting colonies along the coasts, bringing with them temples of marble and the hum of philosophy. Phoenicians, ancestors of the Carthaginians, had also arrived, establishing their own outposts and harbours. Native Sicilians lived in the interior, cultivating the fertile valleys, enduring the tides of outsiders who swept across their land. Sicily was always a prize, too rich to be ignored, too exposed to remain untouched. Its soil was dark, with volcanic richness, a gift of Mount Etna, whose looming presence reminded all who gazed upon it that creation and destruction often shared the same source. Grain grew in abundance, feeding armies and cities alike. Olive groves and vineyards spread across the landscape, offering wealth not only in sustenance but in trade. Whoever held Sicily could feed thousands, could command the central waters of the Mediterranean, could watch both Italy and Africa with equal ease. The island was not merely land, it was leverage. For Carthage, Sicily had long been part of its sphere. Colonies and allies dotted the western coast, giving the city of merchants both safe harbours and sources of grain. Carthaginian ships moved in and out of its ports, linking the island to the vast web of trade that stretched from Iberia to the Levant. The Greeks, strong in the east of Sicily, often contested this influence, and wars had been fought between them and Carthaginian forces long before Rome had any say in the matter. Yet the balance, though unstable, endured. Each side accepted that Sicily was a place of tension, a place where neither could fully dominate, but neither could withdraw. Rome, meanwhile, had been occupied with the conquest of Italy. Its legions marched across mountains and valleys, binding the peninsula under its control, but once the Italian lands were secured, the Romans could not help but look outward, and there, just across the narrow strait, Sicily loomed. It was close enough to touch, close enough to tempt. Rome did not yet have fleets to rival Carthage, but the island's position and riches were too significant to ignore. The spark that would kindle the rivalry came not from grand strategy, but from local quarrels. A small city in Sicily, caught between factions, sought aid from outside powers. One side appealed to Carthage, the other to Rome. What might have remained a regional conflict became, in that moment, the opening through which two great rivals stepped onto the same stage. Once Rome sent legions across the strait, and Carthage landed forces to oppose them. The rivalry ceased to be a matter of glances and treaties. It became war. The struggle for Sicily was unlike anything Rome had yet faced. For the first time, it was drawn into battles beyond the Italian mainland, into a contest shaped not only by soldiers on land, but by ships at sea. Carthage, with its centuries of naval mastery, seemed to hold the advantage. Its fleets patrolled the waters with confidence, its commanders seasoned in the art of maritime war. Rome, by contrast, had little experience on the waves. Its strength was in its legions, its discipline on land. The sea was a new and uncertain arena. But Rome was nothing if not adaptable. Where others saw limitation, Rome saw opportunity. Captured Carthaginian ships were studied, copied and rebuilt in Roman shipyards. The Romans, unfamiliar with naval warfare, devised ways to turn sea battles into something resembling land battles. They built boarding bridges, allowing their soldiers to cross from ship to ship, transforming naval combat into a clash of infantry upon floating platforms. What they lacked in seamanship, they compensated for with ingenuity and discipline. Sicily itself became the chessboard on which this great contest was played. Carthaginian armies, drawn from mercenaries across Africa and Iberia, clashed with Roman legions hardened by years of fighting in Italy. Cities changed hands, sieges dragged on, harbours were blockaded. The island, so fertile and beautiful, became scarred by war. For the Sicilians it was a tragedy. For Rome and Carthage it was the proving ground of ambition. The war revealed much about the character of both powers. Carthage fought with wealth, hiring soldiers from distant lands, relying on its fleets to carry and supply them. Rome fought with citizens, its own people filling the ranks, its strength drawn not from silver, but from duty. Each defeat Rome suffered was followed by new efforts, new legions, new ships built with astonishing speed. Each setback for Carthage was more costly, for mercenaries demanded higher pay, and loyalty was fragile when measured only in coin. For over 2 decades, Sicily was contested. Battles flared and faded, victories won and lost, fortunes shifted with the tides. Yet the underlying truth remained. Neither Rome nor Carthage could abandon the island, for to do so would be to concede the future. The struggle was not about a single city, nor even about Sicily itself, but about which power would dominate the Mediterranean. In time, Rome's persistence wore down its rival. The legions adapted to foreign soil, the fleets grew more confident, the will of the citizens proved inexhaustible. Carthage, stretched thin by the costs of war and the instability of mercenary armies, found itself unable to match Rome's relentless pressure. The spark that Sicily had lit had become a flame consuming both powers, but it was Rome that emerged stronger from the fire. Sicily, once a mosaic of Greeks, natives and Carthaginians, became Rome's first true province beyond Italy. Its fertile fields would now feed Roman armies. Its harbours would shelter Roman fleets. The acquisition was not only strategic, but symbolic. Rome had crossed the threshold from a power of the land to a power of the sea. The rivalry with Carthage, once an abstract tension, was now a living conflict, and the Mediterranean would never again know peace between them. Yet even in victory, Rome had not destroyed Carthage. The city born from the sea remained formidable, its wealth intact, its fleet still vast. The rivalry was only beginning, and Sicily had merely been the opening act. But the spark had been lit, and once fire begins to burn, it seeks fuel wherever it can find it. On the island where wheat grew tall under Etna's shadow, where harbours opened like gateways to continents, the course of history shifted. 2 powers had stepped into open conflict, and from that step, an empire would rise. The Mediterranean, vast yet intimate, was never a barrier but a highway. Across its waters drifted merchants, soldiers and sailors. Across its tides moved the ambitions of empires. From the soft spray on the bow of a ship to the salt that dried on a soldier's lips, the sea was both a challenge and a promise. Whoever ruled its waters did not merely control a route, they controlled the lifeblood of the ancient world. And it was here, between the salted winds and restless waves, that Rome and Carthage came face to face. Carthage had long known the sea as its element. The city itself had risen from its harbour, the Phoenician inheritance clear in every mast and sail. Its merchants had once pushed beyond the Pillars of Hercules, tracing the coast of Africa, reaching into Iberia, and even whispering of voyages beyond the Atlantic. To Carthage, the sea was a second home, and its triremes and quinqueremes were not just ships, but extensions of its very identity. For generations, Carthage had mastered this world of shifting tides, and its power seemed unshakable. Rome, by contrast, was born inland. Its people had tilled soil, marched across plains, and built their strength upon land. When their eyes first turned toward the sea, they did so as novices, uncertain and untested. Yet the Romans had one quality that made them dangerous to even the most seasoned seafaring power. They learned quickly. Every defeat was a lesson, every storm a teacher, every captured ship a model. Rome did not accept ignorance as permanent. It turned weakness into adaptation. The first great wars fought upon the waves tested this resolve. Carthaginian fleets, sleek and swift, patrolled the waters with the confidence of centuries. Roman ships, clumsy in their early design, often fell prey to storms and superior seamanship. But the Romans, unwilling to yield, devised a way to transform naval combat into something familiar. They created the corvus, a boarding device that bridged ships together, turning sea battles into floating fields where Roman infantry could fight as if upon solid ground. It was an innovation born of necessity, a recognition that Rome could not yet match Carthaginian skill with the oar, but could overwhelm with discipline and steel. Clashes across the Mediterranean became scenes of wooden giants crashing against each other, the thunder of rams striking hulls mingling with the cries of men. Salt spray stung their eyes, and the air was thick with smoke from burning ships. Victory did not always belong to the better sailors, but often to the more stubborn fighters. And Rome was nothing if not stubborn. The sea itself seemed to conspire against both powers. Storms could undo in a single night what years of shipbuilding had created. Entire fleets sank beneath the waves, swallowed without distinction of flag. Sailors who had survived battle, drowned in silence, claimed not by enemy spears, but by the indifference of the deep. These disasters might have humbled other nations, but Rome treated them as mere obstacles. Shipyards worked tirelessly, forests fell to provide timber, and within months new fleets replaced the lost. For every storm that scattered their ambitions, Rome sent back more ships, as though the Mediterranean itself could be bent to their will. The struggle extended far beyond Sicily. Carthaginian harbours stretched across Africa and into Iberia, their fleets darting like shadows from one port to another. Roman ships pressed outward, first tentatively, then with growing confidence, learning to patrol coasts, blockade strongholds, and supply their legions abroad. The war was no longer confined to one island. It was carried across the waters, wherever ships could sail and harbours could shelter. Mercenaries filled Carthaginian decks, soldiers from distant lands fighting for coin, their loyalty as fluid as the tides. Romans, by contrast, filled their ships with citizens who bore the burdens of war as duty rather than trade. This difference was felt in the rhythm of the struggle. Carthage, though wealthy, found itself strained by the constant need to pay and supply men who fought without deeper allegiance. Rome, though bloodied by losses, drew endlessly upon the resolve of its people, who returned again and again to the oars and the decks. Salted winds carried more than war. They carried messages of endurance and ambition. From the prow of a Carthaginian quinquereme, the sea stretched like a realm already possessed. From the deck of a Roman trireme, it looked like a frontier waiting to be claimed. Each wave rocked not only the ships, but the balance of power itself. The Mediterranean became a theatre of patience, as much as violence. Fleets stalked one another, sometimes clashing in decisive encounters, other times shadowing each other across days of tense silence. Supply ships laden with grain and oil were as important as warships armed with rams. For armies on distant shores, could not fight without sustenance. Blockades starved cities, and harbours became prizes equal to fortresses. The sea was not empty space. It was contested ground, marked by invisible lines of control that shifted with every battle. For Carthage, the war tested the very foundation of its seaborne identity. Its admirals, once unchallenged, now faced a rival that refused to remain in the shadow of inexperience. Rome's ships multiplied, its sailors hardened by trial. Where once Carthage had gazed upon the sea with unchallenged ownership, now it found itself contested, its dominance eroded wave by wave. The salted winds bore witness to extraordinary moments. Great battles erupted with hundreds of ships locking together, the horizon darkened by sails. Soldiers fought hand to hand above waters that swallowed the fallen without mercy. Fires consumed decks, sending flames racing across tarred ropes and sails, smoke rising like dark signals against the sun. And when the fighting ended, the sea itself remained silent, carrying the wreckage and the memory of the dead upon its tides. Rome's persistence began to yield results. Victories were not always grand, but they accumulated. Each captured harbour, each defeated fleet, each rebuilt navy pressed Carthage further into defence. Carthage, though still rich and proud, could not replace its losses as swiftly. Its reliance on hired soldiers became a weakness, while Rome's citizen army and relentless shipbuilding proved inexhaustible. Yet for all its struggles, Carthage remained formidable. Its admirals were clever, its fleet still dangerous, its harbours still strong. The rivalry across the Mediterranean became less a single war than a series of tests, each sharpening the edge of both powers. Neither could yet destroy the other, but both could feel the shape of what was coming. The Mediterranean was no longer a shared space of merchants and sailors. It had become a contested sea, a place where the ambitions of two empires rashed endlessly against one another. The salted winds carried whispers of the future. Rome had shown it could master the sea, just as it had mastered the land. Carthage, though battered, had shown it would not vanish quietly. Between them stretched the waters of a world too small for both to dominate. The rivalry was now no longer about Sicily, nor about harbours or fleets alone. It had become about destiny, about who would shape the Mediterranean into their own image. And so the sea rolled on, restless and indifferent, bearing the weight of two powers who would not yield. Ships continued to launch, sails continued to unfurl, oars dipped into the water in endless rhythm. The warships and salted winds carried the fate of empires, and the Mediterranean, once a shared stage, became the arena upon which Rome and Carthage struggled for supremacy. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage, once only a contest of harbours and trade, soon demanded more than ships on the waves. It demanded armies upon the land. Sicily, that fertile island suspended between Italy and Africa, became the stage where spears were raised, shields locked, and the ambitions of two worlds collided for the first time in open battle. Its valleys and rugged hillsides echoed with the tramp of marching feet, while the coasts filled with sails and the cries of men preparing for war. For Carthage, the battlefield was familiar ground. Its soldiers were seasoned by campaigns across Africa and Iberia, accustomed to the varied demands of empire. Mercenaries from Gaul, Numidia, Iberia and Greece filled its ranks, each bringing their own weapons and traditions. Spearmen stood beside horsemen, and war elephants, towering above the battlefield, carried the memory of distant lands into the heart of Sicily. Carthaginian commanders trusted in this diversity, seeing it as a strength, a mosaic of war that reflected their far-reaching influence. Rome entered the struggle differently. Its armies were drawn not from hired men, but from the citizenry itself. farmers and craftsmen laid aside their ploughs and tools to take up arms, returning to the soil only when campaigns ended. Each soldier carried not merely a weapon, but the weight of duty to family and the state. The Roman legions were still young in their craft, but they were bound by discipline, by relentless drilling, and by an unshakable belief that Rome's survival depended on their endurance. When the two powers first met in battle, the ground shook with the clash of opposing ideals. Carthaginian mercenaries fought fiercely, but their loyalty was always measured against the gold they received. Romans, though less experienced, stood firm with the stubbornness that would become their hallmark. Battles in Sicily were brutal and uncertain, fields strewn with the fallen of many tongues and banners. Victory seemed to drift back and forth like the tide, never resting long in one camp. Yet it was not on the fields alone that the balance of power began to shift. Rome, still new to the sea, recognized that armies could not endure without supplies, nor could victories be secured if Carthaginian fleets roamed unchallenged. To fight Carthage upon equal terms, Rome needed more than soldiers. It needed a navy. And so, amid the smoke of battles and the cries of the wounded, Roman shipyards came alive with a new purpose. The Romans had never been known for seamanship, but they possessed something equally potent: the will to learn by imitation. When a Carthaginian King Karimi washed ashore, battered but intact, Roman builders descended upon it with relentless curiosity. They measured its beams, studied its joints, and traced every line of its design. From this single prize, they built an entire fleet, copying the shape of their enemy's strength and multiplying it with the determination of their own hands. But Rome did not stop at imitation. Knowing their sailors could not match Carthaginian skill at manoeuvring, they devised a way to transform naval combat into a contest more suited to their strengths. From their workshops emerged the corvus, a heavy boarding bridge fixed with iron spikes. When lowered upon an enemy ship, it locked the two vessels together, erasing the advantage of seamanship and turning the deck into a battlefield of infantry. At sea, Rome would not sail like Carthage, it would fight like Rome. The first tests of this new strategy were dramatic. Carthaginian captains, confident in their centuries of naval mastery, found themselves suddenly trapped by Roman innovation. Ships that once danced nimbly across the waves were seized and turned into floating arenas of close combat. Roman soldiers swarmed over decks with shields raised and swords flashing, fighting as though the sea itself had been turned to stone beneath their feet. Battles that might have been decided by skill at the oar were now decided by steel in the hand. The birth of Roman naval might was not smooth. Storms claimed entire fleets, scattering ships and drowning men who had never learned to swim. Shipbuilding strained resources, demanding forests be cut and ports expanded. Yet Rome endured. Each loss was replaced, each wreck rebuilt, each drowned sailor honoured by another, ready to take his place. The rhythm of hammer and saw in Roman shipyards became as vital to the war as the tramp of legionary boots upon the ground. As fleets grew, so too did the scale of battles. The Mediterranean filled with the thunder of rams striking hulls, the groan of wood under stress, and the shouts of men boarding and resisting. Carthage, though still skilled and formidable, now faced an enemy that could no longer be dismissed as an amateur at sea. Rome's stubborn adaptation transformed it from a land power into a rival across two elements, stretching the contest wider and deeper than ever before. On land, the presence of these navies altered the nature of war. Armies could be supplied across longer distances, strongholds could be blockaded from both shore and sea, and reinforcements could arrive with unexpected swiftness. Sicily became a chessboard where every harbour mattered, where a single captured cove could shift the balance of an entire campaign. Carthaginian generals, once secure in their ability to dominate the island through control of the waves, found their movements increasingly constrained. Roman commanders, buoyed by their new fleets, pressed harder, knowing they could rely on supply lines guarded by their ships. The first clash of armies and the first true rise of Roman naval might were not separate events but parts of the same unfolding rivalry. Each defeat taught Rome persistence. Each victory taught Carthage caution. Neither could yet claim dominance, but the shape of the struggle was becoming clear. This was no brief conflict of neighbours. It was a struggle for the soul of the Mediterranean, one that would draw strength from both land and sea. War elephants trampled across fields, while above them Roman boarding bridges crashed down upon Carthaginian ships. Grain stores were burned, harbours fortified, hills seized and lost again. The violence seemed endless, but behind it pulsed a rhythm of determination that neither power would abandon. Carthage fought to preserve the wealth and dominion it had long commanded. Rome fought to prove that its ambitions could stretch beyond Italy, that its will could shape the seas as firmly as it shaped the soil. The winds that carried ships across the Mediterranean also carried the whispers of change. Carthage, though still mighty, now faced an opponent that learned too quickly, rebuilt too often, and endured too stubbornly to be swept aside. Rome, once clumsy upon the water, had begun to move with purpose, its fleets bristling with the strange devices that turned waves into battlegrounds. Sicily, drenched in blood and shadowed by sails, had become the crucible in which the rivalry took its sharpest form. The first clash of armies was only the beginning. What had started as a contest over one island was now expanding into something larger, a rivalry that could not be contained by coastlines or treaties. With every soldier who fell on Sicilian soil, with every ship that sank into the depths, the bond of enmity between Rome and Carthage grew tighter, pulling both powers into a conflict that neither could escape. The birth of Roman naval might did not merely change battles, it changed the nature of empire. Carthage no longer faced an ambitious city upon the Tiber. It faced a rival that had discovered the power of ships, the reach of supply, and the limitless potential of stubborn endurance. Rome was no longer content to gaze outward from its shores. It was prepared to stride across the sea, to plant its legions on foreign soil, and to shape the Mediterranean into its own vision. And as the warships groaned under the weight of men and weapons, as the armies marched and the harbours filled with smoke, the rivalry deepened into something permanent. It was no longer about who would hold Sicily. It was about who would command the sea itself, who would shape the future, and who would endure when the other could not. The sea, once Carthage's unchallenged domain, had given birth to Rome's resolve. And in that transformation, the course of history shifted. The salted winds that once carried Carthaginian sails alone now bore the standards of Rome as well. Two rivals locked upon the same waters, their destinies tied inseparably to the clash of armies and the rise of navies. The struggle that had begun on the seas and fields of Sicily soon spilled outward, seeking new ground upon which to test the endurance of both Rome and Carthage. As battles raged and harbours smouldered, one Carthaginian general rose with a vision that reached beyond the boundaries of the island, a vision that dared to strike not only at Rome's armies, but at Rome itself. His name was Hannibal, and his march would carry shadows from Africa into the very heart of Italy. Hannibal was born of Carthaginian command, the son of Hamilcar Barca, a man whose life had been shaped by the bitter wars in Sicily. From childhood, Hannibal had been bound to the rivalry with Rome, not as an abstract struggle, but as a living oath whispered into his ears by his father. To him, Rome was not merely an enemy, it was the obstacle that stood between Carthage and the preservation of its power. Where others saw treaties and uneasy peace, Hannibal saw only the pause before an inevitable reckoning. To challenge Rome on its own soil was a daring thought. The city had grown strong behind its walls, secure in the strength of its legions and the loyalty of its allies across Italy. Yet Hannibal understood that war was not always won by meeting strength with strength. It could be won by striking where the enemy least expected, by unsettling the ground beneath them. And so he prepared to carry war not across seas, but across mountains, with an army unlike any Rome had ever faced. At the heart of his plan stood the war elephant, towering creatures from Africa, trained to bear men and weapons upon their backs. They were as much symbols as instruments of war. To the Carthaginians, elephants were a projection of their far-reaching influence, beasts drawn from distant lands brought to serve in the conflicts of the Mediterranean. To the Romans, who had seen only a handful in earlier battles, the sight of an entire column of these animals would be both alien and terrifying. The march began in Iberia, where Carthage had built a base of strength. Hannibal gathered soldiers from the tribes of Spain, hardy men who knew the rough terrain and carried their loyalty in exchange for shared spoils. Alongside them marched Africans, seasoned by campaigns across the deserts, and Numidian horsemen, famed for their swiftness and skill. It was an army stitched together from the corners of empire, held not by shared language or heritage, but by the unifying command of Hannibal and the promise of victory. From Iberia they moved north, each step carrying them further from the familiar and deeper into legend. The journey itself became a trial of endurance. Rivers had to be crossed, their waters swollen and treacherous. Tribes along the way resisted, forcing Hannibal's men to fight not only the Romans who waited beyond, but those who stood before them. Supplies dwindled, and the march pressed on through lands that grew colder and harsher with every mile. Yet still they moved, the elephants lumbering forward, leaving great impressions in the earth, as though marking the path of fate itself. The crossing of the Alps became the heart of the march, the moment when determination confronted nature itself. The mountains rose like walls of stone, their peaks hidden in clouds, their passes choked with snow and rock. Few armies had ever attempted such a passage, and fewer still had survived it. Yet Hannibal led his men upward, into the freezing winds and narrow paths, where a single misstep could cast both man and beast into the abyss. The soldiers wrapped themselves in furs, their breath turning to mist as they climbed. The elephants, unused to the cold, shivered under the weight of ice upon their hides. Snow blinded their eyes, and avalanches swept down with sudden violence. At times, the path was so narrow that men and animals could only move in single file, pressing themselves against the rock to avoid the drop. Every step was a struggle. Every mile purchased with lives lost to the mountain as much as to the enemy. Yet the crossing was more than suffering. It was transformation. By the time Hannibal's army descended into the plains of Italy, it had been hardened by trials no Roman legion had endured. Those who had survived the mountains carried not only weapons but the memory of survival itself, a memory that would steel them in battles to come. The elephants, though reduced in number, emerged from the snows like creatures of myth, shadows that Rome had never imagined would fall upon its soil. When news of Hannibal's arrival spread through Italy, it carried with it both disbelief and dread. Rome had expected to face Carthaginian armies across the sea, perhaps in Sicily or in Iberia. The thought that a foreign general could bring an army across the Alps seemed impossible, almost unnatural. Yet the impossible had been done, and the shadow of Carthage now stretched over the fields of Italy. Hannibal wasted no time in pressing his advantage. He sought not merely to defeat Roman legions in battle, but to unravel the network of alliances that bound Italy to Rome. If the cities and tribes that supported the Republic could be persuaded, or forced, to turn, then Rome's strength would fracture from within. Each victory was meant not only to weaken Rome's armies, but to loosen Rome's grip on the lands it claimed. The first clashes on Italian soil were devastating for the Romans. Accustomed to fighting on their own terms, they now faced an enemy who fought with unfamiliar methods. Hannibal's cavalry struck swiftly, outmaneuvering Roman horsemen and cutting down supply lines. His infantry, though drawn from many lands, moved with discipline under his command. And when the elephants charged, their sheer size and weight shattered lines that had once seemed unbreakable. The shadow of Carthage grew longer with each success. Roman soldiers, who once marched with confidence, now faced the fear of an enemy who seemed to know no limits, who had crossed mountains and defeated legions with equal resolve. Towns wavered in their loyalty, some opening their gates to Hannibal, others watching uneasily as the tide of war shifted closer to their walls. Rome, however, did not collapse. The Republic had been tested before, and though its pride suffered, its resolve did not break. Even as Hannibal's victories mounted, Roman leaders called upon their citizens to endure, to raise new legions, to resist with the same stubbornness that had built their city from a village on the Tiber. The struggle was no longer about a single campaign or even a single war. It had become a test of endurance between two powers whose ambitions could not coexist. The march of elephants into Italy was more than a military maneuver. It was a symbol. It declared that no barrier, not mountain nor distance, could shield Rome from the reach of its rival. It showed that Carthage was willing to carry the fight to the very heart of its enemy. And it revealed the kind of commander Hannibal was, one who would endure the harshest trials to place his army in the most dangerous position, because he believed that only by daring the impossible could he achieve the inevitable. The shadows cast by this march did not fade quickly. They lingered in the minds of Romans, who feared what other surprises might emerge, who wondered how far their enemy would go, and who realized for the first time that their republic was not invulnerable. Yet they also lingered in the pride of Hannibal's men, who had seen mountains fall before them, who had walked through snow and blood to stand on enemy soil. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage had entered a new stage. It was no longer a matter of who controlled seas or islands, but of who could endure when the struggle reached its deepest and most relentless form. The elephants that had marched from Africa to Italy were more than beasts of war. They were heralds of a conflict that would shape the destiny of empires. And as they pressed onward into the plains, their massive forms casting long shadows in the sun, they carried with them not only the weight of battle, but the weight of history itself, moving step by step into the story that would decide which power would rise and which would fall. The Mediterranean is warm, but the heart of the struggle between Rome and Carthage would one day be decided not upon its waters, nor its coasts, but upon mountains that seemed more like walls than pathways. There, among peaks clawing at the sky and valleys filled with biting wind, Hannibal Barca led his army in a march that even his enemies would later recall with a kind of awe. It was not only the clash of armies that defined this rivalry, but the endurance of men and beasts who walked where no army was meant to go. Hannibal had long understood that to strike Rome at its strongest was futile. The city's walls were firm, her alliances deeply rooted across the Italian peninsula. Instead, he dreamed of striking Rome at her heart in a way she did not expect, by bringing war across the Alps, dropping into Italy from a direction that no Roman general had thought possible. To do this, he would need not just soldiers, but conviction, not just courage, but something closer to obsession. His march across the mountains would become a story carved into the memory of history, not of triumph alone, but of suffering, endurance, and the shadow of ambition stretching across snow and stone. The army that gathered under his banner was unlike any other. There were Numidian horsemen, light riders swift as shadows. There were Iberian warriors with curved blades, men hardened by the hills of Spain. There were Libyan infantry trained to stand in tight formations, shields overlapping in long walls of bronze. And then there were the elephants, beasts pulled from the hot plains of Africa, massive and foreign, their bulk and trumpeting cries unlike anything the people of Italy had ever seen. To Hannibal, they were more than animals. They were symbols, reminders that Carthage did not march quietly, but with a force that seemed larger than life. The Alps were no gentle hills. Their valleys twisted into deep gorges. Their slopes rose with cruel steepness. At one moment, the army would find itself walking along a narrow ridge where a single misstep meant plunging into emptiness. At another, they would climb paths where the sun offered no warmth, and the rocks themselves seemed to cut at their feet. The mountains loomed not as mere obstacles, but as living things, unyielding, cold, and indifferent to human ambition. As Hannibal's men began the ascent, they carried not only weapons, but supplies enough to survive the unknown. Grain sacks strapped to mules, skins of water, ropes, and tools. Yet supplies grow lighter with each passing day, and hunger is a soldier's truest enemy. In the valleys, the army could find food from villages clinging to the mountainsides, but high above, only snow and stone remained. The men chewed on whatever they could find, roots pulled from frozen soil, leather boiled into something like soup, and on the harshest days, nothing at all. The weather turned against them with sudden violence. Storms swept across the peaks, snow falling so thickly it erased the line between sky and earth. Soldiers wrapped themselves in cloaks, their breath turning into clouds that froze in their beards and hair. Fingers stiffened, feet blistered, and then went numb. Men stumbled and fell, sometimes into the snow, sometimes over the cliffs. An army that had once seemed vast now thinned, not by the sword, but by the cruelty of the mountains. And yet they pressed on, because behind them was a dream, and ahead of them was Rome. Hannibal himself rode among them, sometimes on horseback, sometimes on foot, urging them forward. His presence was not that of a distant commander, but of a leader who endured the same cold, the same hunger. Soldiers looked to him and saw not a man immune to hardship, but a man who shared it with them, and it bound them tighter than iron. The elephants fared poorly in the snow. Their feet, broad and heavy, broke through ice and slipped on stone. Their ears, made for the warmth of the African sun, froze in the biting winds. Yet they, too, marched on. Each step of their massive bodies was like a reminder to the men that even nature itself could not stop them. Some fell, their bodies tumbling down slopes, leaving behind silence where once there had been thunder. Others survived, pressing forward with their trunks sweeping the air, as though testing if the land ahead was ready to receive them. The army's greatest enemies were not only the mountains themselves, but also the people who lived within them. The tribes of the Alps knew the land well, and though some offered passage, others saw opportunity in the foreign army. They rolled boulders down onto narrow paths, ambushed from cliffs above, and vanished as swiftly as they struck. Hannibal's soldiers fought them with grit, but each ambush took lives. Each skirmish sapped strength. The mountains were a battleground even before Rome's legions ever appeared. At one point, the path itself seemed to dissolve. An avalanche had swept away the track that once wound around a cliff, leaving only a sheer drop. Hannibal's men halted, the way forward blocked. But Hannibal did not accept defeat. He ordered fires lit against the frozen rock. heating it until the surface cracked. Then with tools and brute strength, his men pried the stone apart, carving a new road where none had existed. It was slow, punishing work, but at last the path stretched forward once more, and the army continued its march. Days turned into weeks. Each dawn brought another struggle, each night another test of endurance. Yet with every step, the mountains grew smaller. Valleys widened, slopes softened, and the army could feel the weight of the peaks lifting. When at last they descended, they emerged not as the same force that had set out, but as something transformed. They had lost perhaps half their men, countless animals, and much of their strength. Yet what remained was hardened, bound by suffering and survival into a weapon sharper than before. From the peaks of the Alps, Hannibal's army stepped into Italy. The land stretched before them green and fertile, a land Rome had long called her own. The villagers who looked upon them must have seen not men, but spectres. Warriors, draped in ragged cloaks, faces burned by wind and scarred by frost, elephants moving like shadows of another world. And behind those eyes was a resolve that no mountain could break. Rome had thought her northern frontier safe. The Alps were walls, and behind walls a city feels secure. But now those walls had been climbed, crossed and shattered by a man whose ambition was not stopped by nature itself. Hannibal stood upon Italian soil, his army behind him, and ahead lay the fields where his name would be carved into history. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a question of ships on the sea, or skirmishes over islands. It was now a war fought in the heart of Italy, upon the very land Rome had sworn was untouchable. Hannibal had brought the fight to her doorstep. The mountains had tested him, and though they had taken much, they had not taken his resolve. Now the shadow of Carthage stretched not only across the sea, but across the very soil of Rome's dominion. And as the sun rose over Italy, Hannibal's soldiers, weary but unbroken, looked upon the land before them and knew their march had only begun. The land of Italy had never seen such a march. Hannibal, having crossed the walls of the Alps, now moved like a storm across the peninsula. Villages surrendered, others resisted and were swept aside, and always the shadow of the Carthaginian host moved closer to the beating heart of Rome. The Senate, proud and unyielding, refused to bow to fear. To them, Hannibal was a menace, but one that could be broken with Roman strength and Roman resolve. Years of skirmishes had already shown that this was no ordinary war. At Trebia, Roman legions had been lured into icy rivers and crushed. At Lake Trasimene, entire columns had been swallowed by a mist and ambush. Each defeat struck deeper into Rome's pride, and yet the city stood firm. Pride can harden the will, but it can also blind the eyes, and it was pride, as much as steel, that would lead Rome to one of the darkest days in her long history. The fields near the town of Cannae stretched wide beneath the sun, flat and open, a canvas upon which armies could draw their plans. Here Hannibal waited. His army, though smaller than Rome's, was shaped not only by discipline, but by experience. Iberian swordsmen, Libyan spearmen, Gaulish warriors fierce with passion, Numidian horsemen quick as the wind, all stood ready. And the elephants that had survived the mountain march, though fewer now, remained as living symbols of Carthage's reach. Rome answered with a force greater in number. A mass of legionaries gathered from across the Republic. Nearly twice Hannibal's strength, they marched with confidence, their standards rising above the plain, their armour gleaming in the light. For them, Cannae was meant to be an ending. An end to Hannibal's defiance. An end to the humiliation of defeats. An end to the shadow that had haunted their land for too long. The morning broke with dust, stirred by thousands of feet. The Romans advanced in dense formation, their legions packed tighter than ever before. Their generals believed that weight and sheer force would crush Hannibal's line. They envisioned the enemy breaking under pressure, splintering into fragments, and fleeing across the fields. Hannibal, however, had shaped his army like a snare. At the centre of his line, he placed his Iberian and Gaulish troops, warriors known for their fierce charges, but less suited for holding ground against the Roman machine. He arranged them not in a straight wall, but in a gentle curve, bowed outward like the arc of a crescent. Behind them, waiting in reserve, stood his hardened Libyan infantry, veterans with long spears and iron discipline. On the wings, his cavalry gathered, one side led by his Numidians, the other by his heavy horsemen from Iberia and Gaul. It was a formation that seemed weak in the middle, inviting the Romans to strike deep. But weakness here was a mask. The battle began with cavalry clashing on the wings, the thundering of hooves, the shouts of riders, the clash of steel. Yet in the centre, the Romans pushed forward, their dense columns driving into the crescent of Hannibal's line. Step by step, the Carthaginian centre gave ground, the crescent bent, folding inward, drawing the Romans ever deeper. Dust rose thick, and the sun beat down upon helmets, and that grew hot with each passing moment. The Romans believed they were winning. They pressed harder, tighter, their sheer numbers overwhelming the centre before them. The Carthaginian warriors fell back, not in panic but in rhythm, as if guided by an unseen hand. The crescent deepened, becoming a bowl, and still the Romans poured in. Their formation, once wide, now narrowed, trapped by its own momentum, and then the wings closed. Hannibal's Libyan infantry, waiting on either side, wheeled inward like great doors shutting, their spears levelled, their shields locked. And suddenly the Romans were no longer pressing into weakness, but caught in an iron vice. At the same moment, Hannibal's cavalry, victorious on the flanks, swept around behind the Roman mass. The trap snapped shut. What followed was not battle, but slaughter. The Romans, packed so tightly they could scarcely lift their swords, found themselves surrounded on all sides. Each man was pressed against his neighbour, unable to swing freely, unable to manoeuvre. The Carthaginians advanced with precision, cutting down the outer layers, then pressing inward. The plain echoed with cries of rage, of fear, of death. Dust and blood mixed in the air, and the sun bore witness to a scene that would haunt Rome for generations. Hour after hour, the killing went on. Legionaries fell in heaps, trampled by friend and foe alike. Horses, spearmen, swordsmen, all pressed into a whirl-de-fire of destruction from which there was no escape. Some Romans tried to break free, only to find cavalry cutting them down from behind. Others stood their ground, knowing no hope but refusing to yield. Pride had brought them here, and pride held them fast, even as it destroyed them. By the day's end, the fields of Cannae were carpeted with Roman dead. Estimates say as many as 50,000 were slain. An ocean of blood spilled upon the earth. Consuls, senators, men of noble birth lay side by side with common soldiers, their bodies equal in death. Never before had Rome suffered such a loss. Not even in her earliest struggles, the Republic, so proud of her legions, had been humbled in a single day. And yet Hannibal did not march upon Rome itself. His army, victorious, lingered in Italy, winning allies among those weary of Roman rule. Cities opened their gates, tribes pledged their loyalty, and the Republic's alliances trembled. Still, the city of Rome endured. Walls do not fall to fear alone, and Rome's heart, though wounded, did not collapse. Cannae was more than a battle. It was a lesson carved in blood. That pride without caution leads to ruin, that numbers without wisdom crumble, and that even the strongest power can find itself humbled in the span of a single day. For Hannibal, it was the pinnacle of his genius, the proof that Rome was not invincible. For Rome, it was a scar that would shape her destiny. From that field of blood, the rivalry deepened. Rome, though broken, would rise again, fueled not only by vengeance, but by the unshakable belief that survival was its birthright. Carthage, though triumphant, had shown the world its strength, but also revealed the enormity of the task before it. The war was far from over, and as the sun set over the plain of Cannae, the silence was broken only by the wind moving across the grass, carrying with it the whispers of tens of thousands who would never march again. The fields of Cannae had been drenched with Roman blood, yet the city did not fall. Hannibal waited for Rome to tremble into surrender, for her allies to abandon her, for her walls to open in despair. But Rome was no ordinary state. Her pride had been shattered, her armies slaughtered, her commanders humbled, and still she endured. Out of ruin, Rome discovered something it had seldom needed before: patience. The Senate, shaken yet unbroken, gathered within their marble halls. Voices rose, some calling for negotiation, others urging for vengeance, many struggling simply to comprehend the scale of loss. 50,000 men were gone, yet the city still breathed. To send envoys, to seek peace with Hannibal, would have meant an end not only to the war, but to the very spirit of the Republic. Rome's leaders chose the harder path. They would not bend, not even in the face of annihilation. The city prepared itself as though it were a fortress. Women gave up their jewels, melted into coin for the state. Boys too young for war were trained with wooden swords in the fields. Old men who had once fought in earlier wars returned to drill once more. Slaves were promised freedom if they took up arms. Every resource, every body was turned toward survival. Hannibal had struck at the body of Rome, but the soul of the Republic only grew sharper. And then came Fabius Maximus. He was not the kind of commander to match Hannibal in daring charges or brilliant traps. He was slow, deliberate, a man of patience where others clamoured for action. In earlier years, such caution had been scorned, but now, after Cannae, it became the shield that Rome so desperately needed. Fabius understood that Hannibal thrived on open battle, on swift movements and clever snares. To meet him head-on was to invite disaster. So Fabius refused. He shadowed Hannibal's marches, staying close enough to watch, far enough to avoid being trapped. He struck only when the Carthaginian foragers strayed too far. He burned crops, leaving empty fields where Hannibal's men had hoped for food. He blocked mountain passes, not to confront Hannibal, but to slow him, to frustrate him, to wear him down. To the Roman people, it often felt like cowardice. They had grown used to swift victories, to legions that crushed resistance. Now their armies marched, but did not fight, watched but did not strike. They mocked Fabius as the delayer. Yet with each passing season, as Hannibal failed to take Rome itself, the wisdom of delay became clearer. Patience was no longer weakness. It was survival. Hannibal moved across Italy like a restless storm. He won allies among discontented cities, but not enough. He ravaged fields, burned villages, defeated Roman detachments when he could catch them, but always the heart of Rome eluded him. His army, once magnificent, found itself stretched thin. Supplies dwindled. New recruits came slowly. The longer the war dragged on, the heavier its weight pressed upon him. Rome, meanwhile, rebuilt. Her system of allies, once shaken, held firm in surprising ways. Some cities wavered, tempted by Hannibal's victories, but many remained loyal. The Republic's network of loyalty and obligation, built over centuries, proved stronger than Hannibal had imagined. Each time he hoped for a flood of support, he received instead a trickle. And Rome, by refusing decisive battle, gave her allies time to reflect, to weigh fear against duty, and in many cases to choose Rome once again. In the countryside, the scars of war deepened. Farmers abandoned fields blackened by fire. Villagers fled to fortified towns, carrying what little they could. Roads that had once carried trade now bore the tramp of soldiers' feet. Yet still, life persisted. The Republic did not vanish into despair. It adjusted, endured, and prepared. The strategy of patience was not without cost. Each harvest lost to Hannibal's raids weakened Rome's granaries. Each delay stretched the Republic's finances thinner. Yet patience, unlike pride, could not be destroyed in a single battle. It was a war of attrition, a contest not of brilliance, but of endurance. Time began to turn. Rome's commanders learned from their mistakes. Young officers who had survived Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae matured into hardened leaders. They studied Hannibal's tactics, his use of terrain, his reliance on speed. They adapted, learning not to chase the bait, not to be lured into traps. Step by step they began to reclaim their confidence. Hannibal, for all his brilliance, faced a burden Rome did not. Each mile of Italian soil he marched upon was hostile ground. Each winter stretched his supplies thinner. Each year made his cause less urgent in the eyes of Carthage's leaders back home. The Senate in Carthage was cautious, reluctant to pour endless men and treasure into Hannibal's gamble. He had crossed the Alps with vision, but visions cannot feed an army, and so, though Hannibal remained undefeated in open battle, the balance of power began to shift. Rome, patient and deliberate, discovered that sometimes survival itself is victory. Each year she endured was another year Hannibal failed to bring her down. This patience reshaped the Republic. Rome learned that empires are not won only with daring charges or glittering triumphs, but with the quiet strength to withstand disaster. The people who had once demanded quick victory came to understand the deeper power of resilience. A city that could endure Cannae and yet stand unbroken was a city destined to outlast any single general, no matter how brilliant. For the soldiers in the camps, for the citizens within the walls, for the senators debating into the night, patience became a kind of weapon. It dulled Hannibal's edge, blunted his momentum, and stretched his hopes thin across years of struggle. Rome was no longer chasing glory. She was waiting for the right moment to strike. That moment was drawing closer. The Republic was raising new generals, men who would take the lessons of patience and merge them with renewed ambition. Hannibal still roamed the fields of Italy, his shadow long, his presence feared. Yet beyond those fields, in lands across the sea, Rome's gaze began to shift. She had learned to endure, and now she would learn to strike, not at the invader's camp, but at the roots of his strength far away. Patience had bought time, and time had reshaped the war. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage was no longer one of sudden blows, but of endurance, of strategy, of whose resolve would bend first. And as the seasons turned, it became clear that though Hannibal's genius had carved scars deep into Italy, Rome's patience had given her something greater than revenge. It had given her survival. The fields still bore the memory of battles lost. The countryside still carried the marks of fire and ruin, but the Republic lived. And in that simple fact lay the seed of her future strength. The rivalry that bound Rome and Carthage was never contained to one battlefield. It spread like the tide, shifting from mountains and plains to the waters that connected their worlds. And upon those waters, the fortunes of Carthage began to dim. For centuries, Carthage had been mistress of the sea. Her ships, fast and agile, had sailed from the coasts of Africa to the far reaches of the Mediterranean. Phoenician craft, built by master shipwrights, carried not only merchants but soldiers, their prows cutting through waves with practiced ease. Carthage's harbours had once been filled with fleets that ruled trade and war alike, yet by the long years of struggle, the balance began to tilt. Rome, once a land power, had learned the language of the sea, and with each passing season her voice grew louder. The loss of Sicily had been the first sign. Carthage had fought to hold it, but Rome's persistence and innovation at sea had changed the course of that contest. The corvus, a boarding device that turned naval duels into infantry battles, had robbed Carthaginian ships of their greatest advantage in speed and manoeuvre. Though many Roman fleets sank in storms, though their sailors often lacked experience, their determination outweighed their weakness. They rebuilt each time, larger, stronger, unwilling to surrender the waves. By the time Hannibal roamed Italy, Carthage's grip on the sea had weakened. Roman patrols moved more freely, their fleets connecting allies, securing supplies, and threatening Carthage's distant holdings. Hannibal himself, brilliant on land, felt the absence of naval dominance keenly. Reinforcements from Carthage trickled rather than flowed. Supplies that might have crossed the Mediterranean with ease now struggled to find safe passage. The sea, once Carthage's shield, had become Rome's road, yet if the waters grew hostile, the earth beneath Hannibal's feet remained firm. On land, his genius kept Carthage's hopes alive. Even after Cannae, when Rome refused to break, his presence in Italy was a constant weight pressing upon the Republic. He moved like a shadow across the countryside, striking where least expected, holding ground where none thought possible. Towns defected to his side. Old enemies of Rome saw in him a chance for freedom, and his veterans remained loyal, even as years of war ground them down. It was on land that Carthage's resilience shone brightest. Hannibal's army, though cut off from full support, remained a weapon Rome could not ignore. Each campaign season, he forced the Senate to divide its forces, to guard its allies, to pour treasure and manpower into keeping Italy from slipping away. Rome may have ruled the waves, but she could not yet dislodge Hannibal from her soil. Carthage itself continued to send aid, but sparingly. The Senate across the sea weighed its choices with caution. Other fronts demanded attention. Iberia, where Roman generals pressed against Carthaginian holdings, and Africa itself, where defence of the homeland always loomed large. Ships still sailed from Carthaginian ports, carrying supplies and reinforcements, but fewer than Hannibal required. Each voyage risked Roman interception, each arrival a fragment of what was needed. The great fleets that had once spread Carthage's power across the Mediterranean were now hesitant, fractured, a shadow of their former strength. Rome's admirals pressed their advantage. They built fleets not merely for battle, but for control, for the steady strangling of Carthaginian trade. Grain ships bound for Italy were escorted, convoys protected, and new harbours fortified. Islands like Sardinia and Corsica became Roman strongholds, cutting further into Carthage's influence. Slowly, the network that had once carried Carthaginian goods across the sea frayed. Rome was learning that empires are not only fought with swords, but with the steady tightening of supply lines. Still, the land war refused to yield. Hannibal remained undefeated in Italy. Roman legions learned caution, learned patience, but they had not yet delivered a blow strong enough to drive him back. Each time Rome sought to cut him off, he shifted. Each time they tightened the net, he slipped free. Villages that looked upon the Roman eagle with fear often looked upon Hannibal with hope. The war became not only a clash of armies, but a contest for loyalty, for the hearts of those who lived upon contested soil. The duality of the conflict, Carthage fading at sea but holding on land, created a strange tension. Rome could feel the advantage growing, yet could not claim victory. Carthage could sense its fleets diminishing, yet clung to the brilliance of its general, who walked still upon enemy ground. The rivalry, sharpened by this imbalance, stretched into something larger than either city had first imagined. Years passed in this uneasy rhythm. Rome struck in Iberia, trying to cut off the roots of Hannibal's strength. Carthaginian commanders there fought fiercely, but without full naval supremacy. Their efforts became harder to sustain. Meanwhile, Hannibal in Italy sought to preserve momentum, to inspire fear and loyalty, to remind Rome that her enemy was not distant, but at her very doorstep. It is tempting to see the sea as decisive, as though Carthage's decline there sealed her fate. Yet history is rarely so simple. Even with weakened fleets, Carthage endured. Even with Roman ships prowling the waters, Hannibal kept his army alive in a hostile land. What the sea took away, the land preserved. What Rome gained in ships, Carthage countered in soldiers' resilience. This balance of weakness and strength shaped the middle years of the war. Rome grew more confident at sea, expanding her reach, while Hannibal clung to Italy with a grip that refused to loosen. Carthage had lost the waters, but so long as her general commanded respect upon the soil of Rome, the struggle remained alive. The rivalry was no longer a matter of who held the sea or who held the land. It became a question of which advantage would outlast the other. Would Rome's dominance of the waves starve Carthage into submission? Or would Hannibal's victories on Italian soil break the Republic's will? Neither answer came swiftly, for wars between giants are not decided in moments, but in the long wear of years. As the seasons turned, the sea bore fewer Carthaginian sails, and Rome's presence upon the waves grew ever stronger. Yet on land, the hoofbeats of Hannibal's cavalry still echoed, and the banners of Carthage still flew where Rome believed they could never stand. The rivalry endured, stretched between water and earth, each side holding what it could, each waiting for the other to falter. And in this waiting, the future of the Mediterranean was being written, not in a single clash, but in the slow struggle of endurance, where seas faded for one, but land still burned bright, still burned. In the rhythm of long wars, time often raises new figures whose presence reshapes the course of events. When armies grow weary and strategies grind against stalemate, a single leader with fresh vision can bend the weight of history. Such was the emergence of Publius Cornelius Scipio, a man whose name would be tied forever to the undoing of Carthage's greatest gamble. By the years when Hannibal's shadow still stretched across Italy, Rome had grown cautious, resilient, but restless. Defeats had scarred her, patience had steadied her, yet the burden of endless defence pressed heavily on the Republic. Generals came and went, victories flickered and died, and the Senate searched for someone who could turn endurance into triumph. In Iberia, the theatre that had long supplied Hannibal's cause, the war offered both danger and opportunity. It was there, among the rivers and hills of Spain, that Scipio began to carve his path. Born into a family of commanders, Scipio had already felt the sting of loss. His father and uncle, both generals in Iberia, had fallen in campaigns against Carthaginian forces. Their deaths left Roman arms weakened in the region, and many believed Spain would slip permanently into Carthage's grip. Yet in this moment of despair, Scipio, still young by the measure of generals, stepped forward. He was elected by the people rather than appointed by tradition, a rare gesture that spoke to Rome's willingness to gamble on him. When he arrived in Iberia, the situation was precarious. Carthaginian armies held strong positions, their commanders experienced, their supply lines anchored by the great city of Carthago Nova. Rome's forces were weary, uncertain, and in need of direction. Scipio gave them not only leadership, but clarity. He was unlike many Roman commanders before him, for he studied his enemies deeply, adapted their strengths, and imagined strategies beyond simple force of arms. His boldest stroke came swiftly. Rather than drag the war through countless skirmishes, he set his eyes upon Carthago Nova itself, the heart of Carthaginian power in Spain. The city was heavily fortified, its position guarded by sea and marsh, its defenders confident. Yet Scipio understood that even the strongest walls could be undone by knowledge of tide and terrain. He led his men in a daring assault, timing the attack with the ebb of waters that exposed an unguarded flank. The Romans surged through, catching the defenders unprepared. Within a day, the great stronghold of Carthage in Iberia had fallen into Roman hands. The capture of Carthago Nova was more than a victory of arms. It was a wound to Carthaginian pride, a severing of their strongest chain of supply. Rome seized vast stores of treasure, weapons and hostages, symbols of power that could now be turned against their enemies. Scipio treated the captives with unexpected mercy, releasing many, earning loyalty where Carthage had ruled by fear. It was a gesture that revealed his mind as much as his swords. He sought not only to conquer, but to bind hearts to Rome. From this moment, his reputation grew. The tribes of Iberia, long swayed by Carthaginian influence, began to reconsider their alliances. Some drifted toward Rome, others wavered, sensing that the balance of power was shifting. Scipio nurtured these changes with diplomacy as much as with battle. He proved himself not merely a commander of legions, but a builder of trust, weaving alliances where once there had been only resistance. On the battlefield, his methods showed a similar creativity. Against seasoned Carthaginian generals like Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother Scipio displayed a flexibility rare among Roman leaders. He studied the enemy's use of cavalry, their deployment of diverse troops, their methods of encirclement. Rather than resist them blindly, he learned, he reshaped Roman tactics, drilling his soldiers to move with precision, to fight as an adaptable force rather than a rigid block. In doing so, he prepared Rome for a new kind of war. Hasdrubal sought to march from Iberia into Italy to join his brother in crushing Rome from two sides. For a time, it seemed Carthage might yet unite its scattered forces and strike a decisive blow, but Scipio pressed hard, defeating Hasdrubal at Becula, forcing him to abandon Spain in haste. Though Hasdrubal eventually reached Italy, the delay and losses had weakened him fatally. His army was destroyed before he could link with Hannibal, and the dream of uniting the brothers' campaigns dissolved into ruin. Meanwhile, Scipio's work in Iberia continued to peel away Carthaginian strength. One by one, cities fell, allies deserted, and the once solid foundation of Hannibal's supplies cracked. By 206 BCE, Scipio stood triumphant in Spain. Carthage had been driven from the peninsula, its resources redirected to Rome, its hopes of reinforcing Hannibal dimmed. It was here, amid victory, that Scipio's mind turned toward the heart of the conflict itself. He understood something that many in the Senate hesitated to admit. As long as Carthage remained secure in Africa, Hannibal could not be broken. Italy might bleed for years more, but the war would never truly end. To cut out the route, Rome must strike at Carthage's own homeland. It was a daring vision, for Africa was distant, defended, and filled with the memory of Carthage's once great fleets. Yet Scipio's boldness lay in seeing what others thought impossible as necessary. When he returned to Rome to argue his case, resistance met him. Many senators still feared Hannibal too deeply to risk diverting strength. The scars of Cannae and other defeats lingered. To send an army across the sea seemed reckless when the enemy still camped on Italian soil. Yet Scipio's confidence, His record of victories and his unshaken conviction gradually swayed the Republic. He was granted command, and with it the chance to carry his vision forward. Even then, his strategy was not mere invasion. He prepared carefully, forging alliances with Numidian leaders in Africa who had grown restless under Carthaginian dominance. Among them was Massinissa, a prince whose cavalry would become crucial to Rome's future triumphs. Scipio saw that wars are not won by force alone, but by weaving networks of loyalty, by turning the enemies of one's enemy into pillars of strength. As he gathered his forces and readied them for the crossing, the tide of the rivalry began to shift in truth. Hannibal still held Italy, undefeated in open battle, yet his supplies dwindled, his reinforcements delayed, his allies uncertain. Carthage's Senate, faced with Scipio's threat to their homeland, would soon be forced to call their greatest general home. The war, stretched across seas and continents, was narrowing its focus to a final reckoning. The rise of Scipio was not the sudden flare of a single battle, but the steady glow of strategy, diplomacy, and innovation. He did not merely answer Hannibal's brilliance with brute force. He crafted a counterweight, one built on adaptability, patience, and vision. Where Hannibal had shocked the world with audacity, Scipio prepared to reshape it with calculation. In the long rivalry between Rome and Carthage, this was the moment when Rome began to move from endurance to dominance. The Republic had suffered, had waited, had learned. Now it had found in Scipio a commander who could turn that patience into decisive action. The Mediterranean, once the stage of Carthage's strength, now prepared to witness a reversal. Fleets would sail not to defend but to strike, legions not to endure but to conquer. And at the centre of this turning tide stood Scipio, carrying with him not only the hope of Rome, but the strategy that would end centuries of Carthaginian mastery. The rivalry that had filled seas and shaken fields was moving toward its final act, and the shape of the empire to come rested upon the shoulders of a man who had risen from loss to reshape the destiny of nations. The long arc of struggle between Rome and Carthage, stretched across seas, mountains, and generations, came at last to a place of dust and heat, far from the Tiber and far from the harbours of Phoenician traders. It was to Zama, a plain in North Africa, that two of history's greatest commanders would lead their armies, carrying with them the weight of decades of rivalry and the fate of empires. For years, Hannibal had stood unshaken in Italy, his victories remembered in whispers and wounds. Yet as Scipio's legions landed in Africa and marched steadily through Carthaginian lands, the balance of the war bent toward a final confrontation. Carthage, once mistress of seas and trade, found herself fighting for survival within sight of her own gates. To meet the threat, she called back the man whose name had terrified Rome for nearly 2 decades. Hannibal crossed once more to Africa, his elephants fewer now, his veterans scarred but loyal, his spirit still carrying the fire of Cannae. The meeting of these two men on African soil seemed almost inevitable, as if the rivalry itself had always been moving toward this collision. Scipio, young but seasoned by Spain and emboldened by vision, faced Hannibal, older now, tempered by endurance and years of war. Between them lay not only armies, but the question of whether Rome's patience or Carthage's audacity would define the future. The plain of Zama was open and bare, a stage where cavalry could sweep wide and infantry could clash without the cover of hills or forests. Hannibal drew up his forces with layers of strength, the first lines made of hastily gathered levies, behind them sturdier troops, and at the core, the veterans who had marched with him through Italy. Scipio arranged his legions with discipline, his maniples spaced to allow for manoeuvre, his cavalry, strengthened by his alliance with the Numidian prince Massinissa, placed upon the wings. Before the battle, there was parley. Scipio and Hannibal met face to face, two commanders who understood each other in ways few ever could. They spoke not with swords, but with words, acknowledging the cost of war, the weariness of endless blood, the possibility of peace, yet neither could concede the ground upon which their nation stood. When they parted, it was with the knowledge that only one could leave the plain as master of the Mediterranean. At dawn, the silence of the desert gave way to the roar of war. Hannibal released his elephants, hoping their charge would shatter Roman lines. But Scipio, anticipating this, had trained his men to open lanes, letting the beasts thunder through harmlessly, where they were met with javelins and panic that turned them back upon their own. The tactic that had once terrified Rome now failed to break her. The first lines of Carthaginian infantry advanced, clashing with Roman shields, but they lacked the cohesion and will of seasoned troops. They fought, but when pressed, they gave ground, retreating into the ranks behind them. Hannibal's veterans, disciplined and hardened, held firm, absorbing the retreating men without breaking formation. The field grew crowded with dust, cries, and the mingling of bodies, yet still the struggle remained undecided. It was the cavalry that tipped the balance. On the wings, Massinissa's Numidian horsemen fought fiercely against Carthage's mounted allies. The contest was even for a time, swirling clouds of riders darting, charging, retreating. But gradually, Roman and Numidian coordination proved stronger. Hannibal's cavalry broke, scattered, and fled the field, leaving his infantry exposed. The clash at the centre grew desperate. Hannibal's veterans fought with the grim strength of men who had marched across the Alps and endured years in hostile lands. They met Roman legionaries, blow for blow, shield against shield, sword against sword. Scipio pressed his men forward, reforming ranks, widening the battle lines to envelop the Carthaginian corps. Still, the outcome hung uncertain, as each side strained under the weight of exhaustion. Then, like a storm returning after silence, the Roman and Numidian cavalry reappeared. Having chased their foes from the field, they wheeled back, striking Hannibal's rear. The veterans of Carthage, surrounded now on all sides, fought with the last of their strength, but even iron will could not withstand the closing jaws. Slowly, relentlessly, the Carthaginian lines crumbled. The plain of Zama, once quiet in the morning sun, became a place of ruin by day's end. The ground was scattered with the fallen, the cries of battle giving way to the silence of aftermath. Carthage's final gamble had failed. Hannibal, the man who had carried war to Rome's doorstep, withdrew, not broken in spirit, but beaten in circumstance. Scipio, his vision fulfilled, stood victorious, his name forever bound to this day as Scipio Africanus. The consequences were swift and heavy. Carthage sued for peace, her senate forced to accept terms that stripped her of empire. She surrendered her fleet, her elephants, her independence in foreign affairs. Heavy tribute bound her, and her once proud city was left humbled, her role reduced from rival to subject. The wealth of trade and the dominance of seas passed now to Rome, whose coffers swelled with the fruits of victory. For Rome, Zama was not merely a battlefield won. It was the moment when the Republic became the undisputed power of the Western Mediterranean. The lessons of patience, endurance, and adaptation had brought her here, and the spoils of triumph would feed her rise into an empire. The shadow of Carthage, once looming across the sea, now flickered faintly, a reminder of what had been. For Hannibal, the silence after Zama was heavy. He lived on, retreating into the politics of a wounded city, carrying with him the knowledge that genius alone could not overcome the weight of nations. His legacy remained, admired even by enemies, but the world he had dreamed of, a Carthage standing equal to Rome, had dissolved into dust. And so the sands of Zama bore witness to the turning of history. The rivalry that had begun with glances across the Mediterranean, that had spilled across islands, seas and mountains, found its culmination here. In the quiet that followed, Rome rose richer, stronger, her path to empire cleared of her greatest rival. Carthage endured, but in the shadow of submission, her days of contest ended. The Mediterranean, once contested, lay now as Rome's sea. And on the plain of Zama, where two of the greatest commanders met and parted, the silence spoke more loudly than the clash of arms. It was the silence of an age closing and another beginning. The dust of Zama had hardly settled before the world began to shift around its memory. Carthage, stripped of her fleets and her empire, had not been destroyed, but she had been unmade. The treaties bound her, the tributes drained her, and the pride of her people was forced to bend beneath Rome's new order. Yet peace, though written on parchment and sealed with oaths, carried within it the quiet weight of resentment and the seeds of future discord. Rome called it peace, for her legions no longer marched in fear of Hannibal's shadow, and her harbours opened freely to the wealth of Mediterranean trade. Grain from Sicily, silver from Spain, and the taxes of allies filled the Republic's coffers, feeding a city that had grown used to the sound of war drums and now turned that energy toward construction, wealth, and influence. But beneath the calm surface, the rivalry that had begun so many decades before had not truly ended. It had only taken a different shape. Carthage, humbled but not erased, remained alive. Her merchants, though bound by Roman oversight, still sailed within narrow limits. Her markets still bustled, her fields still yielded harvests, and her harbours still filled with voices from Africa and beyond. Deprived of empire, the city bent inward, looking to her own land and soil for strength. And slowly, quietly, prosperity began to creep back into her streets. This resilience was dangerous, though it seemed harmless at first. Rome had demanded her tribute, and Carthage paid. Rome had forbidden her wars, and Carthage obeyed. Outwardly, the treaties were kept, and the Republic had no cause to send her legions again across the sea. Yet as years passed, the flow of wealth back into Carthage's markets stirred unease. Rome watched her rival with suspicion, measuring each sign of recovery as if prosperity itself were defiance. The peace was therefore never one of trust. It was peace watched with narrow eyes, peace weighed by the memory of Cannae and Trebia, of elephants on Italian soil and legions cut down by Hannibal's cunning. The Senate of Rome, cautious even in triumph, kept its gaze fixed on the North African coast, convinced that Carthage's silence was not submission, but waiting. Within Carthage, the presence of Hannibal himself deepened the tension. Though defeated, he returned as a figure of respect, his name still carrying power among his people. He entered politics, serving as a magistrate, reforming the finances of the city, and working to pay the crushing indemnities owed to Rome. In this, he succeeded too well. Carthage began to prosper again, the tribute paid not with begging bowls, but with measured order. To Rome, this efficiency was troubling. Hannibal was no longer on the battlefield, yet his hand still shaped Carthage's resilience. Pressure mounted until even in peace, Hannibal's presence was unbearable to his enemies. Accused of conspiring with foreign kings, hounded by Roman suspicion, he left his city, an exile moving from court to court across the eastern Mediterranean. Yet even abroad, his name weighed heavily. For Rome, his shadow lingered long after his legions had vanished from Italy. The years stretched on, and the rivalry settled into a quieter form. Rome grew fat on the wealth of conquest, her senators cloaked in purple, her generals turning toward Greece, Macedon, and the wider world. She no longer feared Carthage as she once had, but she never forgot her. To the Roman mind, Carthage remained a wolf with teeth hidden, a city that could not be trusted to remain bound forever. In Africa, Carthage's neighbours added their part to this restless peace. The Numidian kings, Rome's allies during Scipio's campaigns, now stood close at hand, pressing against Carthaginian lands. They raided, encroached and harassed, knowing that Carthage's treaties forbade her from waging war without Rome's leave. Each time Carthage resisted, she risked Rome's wrath. Each time she bore the insult, her pride sank deeper into bitterness. This was the nature of the long peace, a balance held not by harmony, but by suspicion, humiliation, and the slow grind of memory. To the world beyond, it seemed as though Rome and Carthage had set aside their struggle, but in the hearts of both peoples the rivalry remained alive. Rome, never forgetting her near ruin, believed that only vigilance could protect her. Carthage, never forgetting her humiliation, believed that only patience could restore her dignity. And so the decades passed, shaped by an uneasy stillness. Rome's power stretched further, her legions stamping their presence across the eastern seas. Carthage, bound yet prosperous, grew not in empire but in wealth, her markets humming with trade, her fields rich, her citizens confident once again. Each success whispered of renewal, and each whisper was heard across the sea. To call it peace is to give it too simple a name. It was more like a truce stretched thin across time, a silence filled with watchfulness. The rivalry between Rome and Carthage had been written too deeply into their histories to be undone by treaties. It lived in memory, in suspicion, in the restless gaze across the waters of the Mediterranean. The plain of Zama had ended a war, but it had not ended the story. For the silence after battle is rarely permanent, and the embers of rivalry, though buried beneath ashes, can still glow, waiting for the wind to rise again. The years that followed were years of watching. Across the wide Mediterranean, Rome stood ascendant, her legions no longer confined to the peninsula, but walking across Greece, Macedon, and Asia, with a confidence that came only from certainty in her own strength. And still, always, across the narrow waters of Sicily, her gaze lingered on the city that had once been her equal. Carthage had been quiet, prosperous in the rhythm of markets and fields, but quiet prosperity is rarely invisible. Whispers travelled with merchants who crossed the harbours. They spoke of storehouses full of grain, of ships heavy with trade goods, of walls repaired and streets alive with wealth once more. Carthage, it seemed, was no longer bowed, but rising again in the slow way of a city that refused to die. For Rome, this was troubling. Memory does not fade easily, and in the halls of the Senate, the name of Carthage was still spoken with unease. The voices of caution argued that treaties were intact, that tribute still flowed, that no armies threatened Rome's allies. But there were other voices, harsher, louder, and more insistent. Among them was Cato the Elder, whose journeys had shown him a Carthage that looked far too alive for comfort. Returning to Rome, he spoke with the authority of age, carrying in his hand a fig plucked fresh from African soil. It had travelled across the sea in just 3 days, he said, and so too could armies travel. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of certainty. Carthage must be destroyed. This refrain, repeated at the end of his speeches, regardless of topic, echoed through the Senate chambers. It was less a call to arms than a drumbeat of inevitability. Peace. Bidan hankomun bishit, Iwong had become intolerable, for Rome's greatness now demanded not the containment of rivals, but their erasure. To allow Carthage to live was to live in the shadow of fear, and Rome no longer tolerated fear. Tension turned into pretext. Numidian kings, allies of Rome, pressed against Carthage's lands with greater boldness, taking fields, raiding borders and testing patience. Carthage, bound by treaty, appealed for protection, but Rome gave none. At last, driven by survival, Carthage defended herself, without Roman leave, raising arms against Numidia. This, though born of desperation, gave Rome what she had been waiting for. A treaty had been broken, Rome declared. Carthage had stepped beyond her bounds, and punishment would follow. Legions gathered once more, not as in the old days with anxious hearts, but with the assurance of power long proven. They sailed to Africa, not to measure themselves against a rival equal in strength, but to finish what had been left unfinished at Zama. The city that had once terrified Rome was now the city Rome would erase. When the Roman terms were delivered, they revealed the nature of the coming war. Carthage was ordered to disarm, to surrender her weapons, her fleets, her stores of war. The city obeyed, filling the air with the sound of iron striking stone as arms were piled high and taken away. But then came the final demand, that the people abandon their home, leave their walls behind, and move inland to live far from the sea that had once been their lifeblood. It was a demand not of security, but of obliteration. Carthage refused. A city could surrender its arms, but it could not surrender its soul. And so, in desperation, the citizens began to forge weapons anew, melting down ornaments, reshaping tools, turning every fragment of metal into spear or sword. Women cut their hair to twist into ropes for catapults, and children carried stones for defence. The city prepared, knowing that the end was near, but unwilling to face it without resistance. The siege that followed was long and merciless. Rome closed its grip, choking the city slowly, cutting off supplies, and waiting for hunger to gnaw away at courage. Yet still Carthage held, her walls lined with defenders, her harbours echoing with defiance. Year after year, the struggle dragged on, until finally the Roman assault broke through. Streets became battlefields, houses became fortresses, and each stone of the city was contested. When the end came, it was fire that consumed Carthage. Flames spread from house to house, temple to temple, devouring centuries of history in a final blaze. The cries of the living mingled with the crackle of burning beams, and smoke rose so thick that the sea itself seemed to darken. For 6 days the destruction continued, until nothing remained but smouldering ruins. The city that had once rivaled Rome, that had sent elephants across the Alps and merchants across the seas, was reduced to ash. From those ashes, Rome claimed her triumph. The survivors were sold into slavery, the stones of the city scattered, and the land itself cursed, or so later stories told. Carthage, the rival, the mirror, the equal that had stood against Rome for over a century, was gone. In the silence that followed, Rome stood alone. No rival remained across the western Mediterranean. The wealth of Carthage, her fertile fields, her harbours, her trade, now passed into Roman hands. Grain that once fed Carthage now fed Rome. Trade routes that once enriched her merchants now filled Roman treasuries. The ashes of Carthage became the soil from which Rome's empire grew ever richer. Yet victory carried a strange weight, for while Rome had destroyed her rival, she had also destroyed the measure against which her greatness had long been tested. The wars with Carthage had shaped her legions, hardened her citizens, and forged her empire. Without that rival, Rome turned her gaze outward, to Greece, to Asia, to lands still unconquered. Expansion was no longer about survival, it was about ambition, about glory, about wealth beyond imagining. And so the rivalry that had begun with two cities competing for Sicily ended with one city alone, holding not just Sicily, but the western Mediterranean entire. Carthage had fallen, but in her fall she had given Rome the wealth of empire. The richest fields, the most strategic harbours, the flow of trade across seas, all of it now flowed into the Republic's veins. From this moment, Rome was not merely strong, she was unchallenged. And the silence that lay across the ruins of Carthage was not the silence of peace, but the silence of victory carried too far, where nothing remained to oppose the rising tide of empire. The rivalry had ended, but its legacy endured. Rome had grown rich, not only in gold and grain, but in the memory of what it took to triumph. And though Carthage was gone, reduced to ashes and silence, she lived on in the wealth of her conqueror, and in the cautionary whispers that empires never forget their greatest foes. And so, our quiet journey drifts to its end. Tonight, we walked along distant shores, where two powers once measured each other across the water. We followed merchants carrying goods heavier than they seemed, treaties drawn in ink more fragile than the sea winds, and the restless pull of ambition that would not let either side remain still. We saw armies rising, fleets swelling, and the slow certainty that peace could never hold when two destinies leaned toward the same horizon. The rivalry of Rome and Carthage was not just a story of battles and victories, it was a long unfolding of patience, pride, fear, and the silent weight of choices that stretched far beyond a single generation. In the sweep of centuries, one would burn, and the other would build upon its ashes. But before we let the night close fully around us, I'd like to hear from you. What moment from this story stayed with you? Was it the glance across the sea, the march of elephants through mountain passes, or the silence that followed when one city was finally no more? Share your thoughts in the comments, because your reflections help keep these forgotten tales alive. And if this quiet telling has helped you drift a little closer to rest, remember to subscribe. It keeps this small circle of listeners connected, each of us adding a light to the map of quiet voices across the world. Until we meet again, may your night be calm, and may history keep whispering its softer stories into your dreams.